bring it to him and let him cleanse you.
Great response. Thank you for that, Adriel. You're listening to Core Christianity with Pastor Adriel Sanchez. Love to hear from you if you have a question about the Bible or the Christian life. Our phone lines are open right now. 833-THE-CORE is the number. You can also email us anytime at questions@corechristianity.com. Got this email from one of our listeners named Gwen, and she says this: "Thank you so much for your program. I appreciate your thoughtful biblical responses to the questions you receive. My question is this. I understand that in vitro fertilization is a complex and debated topic from a religious perspective. As a religious leader and theologian, I'm wondering, how does the Bible and Scripture align with IVF practices?"
Okay, great question. One of those bioethical issues that, as technology advances, we have these new moral dilemmas that we're presented with as human beings, as Christians in particular. And certainly IVF does present us with some moral dilemmas. The first thing I want to just say is quote that beautiful Psalm of David in Psalm 139, verse 13, where he wrote, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." God is sovereign. And as Christians, we recognize that life in the womb is to be protected, that we need to stand up for the rights of the unborn, that abortion is a terrible sin, a heinous sin. From the very beginning of the Christian faith, Christians have stood against the idea of abortion. Also, abandonment in the Roman Empire, it was very common in the Greco-Roman world. If you had a child that you didn't want, you could just expose the child to the elements, just leave them out there on a trash heap, and that was not an uncommon thing. And Christians took a very strong stand against that because of the high view that they had of life, and we need to continue that high view today. Now, with regard to IVF, for those who don't know, it's a procedure, a medical procedure in which eggs are removed from a woman's ovaries and combined with sperm outside of the body to form an embryo. And then those embryos are grown in a laboratory for several days until they're finally placed in the woman's uterus, and hopefully the result is a baby. And let me just also say, one of the reasons it's so difficult is because of families, Christian families, that long to have children but struggle with infertility. I know that that's such a big issue, and so they're looking for options. Well, what can we do? And IVF is one of those options that many go to, many Christians also look to. But as I said, there are some moral issues that we need to be aware of, and part of the reason that those issues exist is because we have that high view of life. A human embryo is made in the image of God. We're talking about a person here, and we believe as Christians that these persons should be cared for and protected. And one of the issues with IVF is in this process of IVF, oftentimes many embryos are created, and then they're inserted into the woman's body with the hope that some of those embryos will implant. And if more than is wanted implant, then typically what you end up having is an abortion. Those embryos that aren't wanted are destroyed. And so there's a huge problem there. And then the rest of the embryos that aren't used oftentimes are either just discarded, disposed of, or frozen. And then there's another question: well, what do we do with all of these frozen embryos if we're talking about human persons? And so you see how this is a complicated issue in one sense, not in another sense, because if you hold to the biblical view that we're talking about a person here, that these embryos are worthy of our protection, care, then clearly any process, any medical procedure that says, oh, well, along the way we're just going to discard a bunch of these embryos, or we're going to probably have to abort some of them that implant if you don't want that many, that's something that Christians should not participate in. Now, does that mean that IVF is totally off of the table for believers? Certainly, any IVF practices where destroying embryos is an option, I think those would be forbidden for us as Christians. And is there a way for, and I think that there is, it just makes it even more challenging of a process, but is there a way for Christians to pursue IVF? Well, yeah, but only if they are going to nurture every one of those embryos that's created throughout the pregnancy. Only if they're, attempting to fertilize as many eggs as they plan to bring to fruition, if you will. And so there's other questions that are brought up there, because that makes the process in terms of chances for success a lot lower, because you're only using a couple of embryos, let's say, as opposed to trying to create a bunch of them and then discarding some of them. So there's wisdom issue here as well, where we're trying to think about, is this, in terms of the financial cost, in terms of where we are as a family, the cost on the woman's body, is this a wise decision too? So I don't want to say it's entirely ruled out from the Christian perspective, but certainly some forms would be entirely ruled out, in any form that doesn't treat the embryo as a human life and doesn't intend to use those embryos and bring them to birth, or seek to do that, I think is also not an option for us as Christians. Thanks for that question.
Mm. On the encouraging side of that, I heard about an organization a while back. I think they're called Snowflake Babies, and they actually, people adopt those frozen embryos with permission from the biological parents. Mm. And so those babies, those embryos that were frozen and were going to be discarded, were actually adopted, and then those children were born. What an exciting thing that is for believers to really, rescue these little embryos.
Yeah. And again, part of that is really viewing them as, this is a person. This is a human life. And so, and people outside of the church who don't have the same convictions that we have as Christians might think, oh, that's crazy. What are you talking about? Those are just a clump. That's just a clump of cells. That's oftentimes the argument that people in favor of abortion will make. But the fact of the matter is just biologically, there's no reason to think that. I mean, here you have all of the components of life. Here you have human life. And so we, as the followers of Christ, we value life and protect the vulnerable. And that's precisely what we should seek to do even in these circumstances.
So well said. Thanks for that, Adriel. You're listening to Core Christianity with